So hi and welcome to Webcast, everybody. I'm here today with colleague and friend Scott King. So Scott is a fellow paramedic colleague of mine, and we've done a lot of work together with World Extreme Medicine prior to now. But what I thought I'd do is, Scott, let you introduce yourself to the guests.
Morning, mate. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting me, and a great opportunity to have this chat and discussion and just share with the world kind of where we are and some of the conversations we've been having privately of just catching up and seeing where we are, rural versus kind of mainstream city. I have been in healthcare since 2002. I started in secondary care originally, before joining pre-hospital care world, sort of in the career route of ambulance care assistant all the way through, and have held many roles in the last 17 years. I've done sort of hazmat, joined heart necessarily off the back of that. I've been an ambulance officer, duty manager, a control room, and I'm now, having spent 4 great years heading up the Trust's regional motorcycle unit for the family. I've moved to a North Devon area and just settling in, finding my feet again, back on front line, which has come at an interesting time, having kind of done lots of jobs where I've been either in incident rooms, and only last week was in the incident room for COVID for the Trust. And it's funny how we've dealt with lots of incidents in the past, whether that's IT issues, whether that's sort of CAD, which I know my colleagues in London have more than experienced of their issues with CAD. Even back to kind of like the Olympics. Obviously, we've had Novichok in Salisbury, which is in the region. So we've managed to draw on quite a lot of lessons learned internally, as well as kind of featuring and picking up on the national picture. And that's something I've been able to bring and sort of hopefully share a little bit with my colleagues on the road in the North Devon area that maybe are a little bit protected from some of the goings on, some of those lessons, if they haven't made their way through and shared.
Fantastic, Scott. Fantastic. So, yeah, you mentioned quite a lot there actually about the CAD, so the computer-aided dispatch system, and when that either breaks down or indeed when there's an excessive demand, versus, like you said, some of the chemical, biological, and viral pandemics, which is what we're in the middle of now, which is really interesting, mate. But a really varied career by all accounts. So just before we deep dive into sort of how you're finding the rural experience now and the demand profiling now in North Devon, just looking back slightly at where you've come from, Scott, which you've held quite a few leadership roles across your career in the ambulance service. Which of those leadership roles do you think you fundamentally had the most control to change and adapt things on the ground?
I think my last role, where I had that mix of being able to respond on a motorcycle, be that first line management of a team of staff, but also having a unique sort of exposure to having to juggle the political kind of world of senior management and staff, kind of understanding the sort of executive roles of the Trust and kind of where their pressures and demands are, and trying to learn in kind of like the last 4 years kind of how to dance and juggle between the two, which can be quite a challenge, especially if your desire is to be quite innovative and proactive and outward facing and kind of bring on new areas of practice or development. I think you need to have the full breadth and understanding of kind of what the political and sort of social economic sort of pressures are on the Trust and the health service as a whole, and learn to pick your fight. So I think for me it was an interesting challenge to kind of look after staff and remain operational and try and pick which elements they wanted and kind of we wanted as a team to kind of push forward and learn how the best way to kind of make friends and influence people.
Indeed, absolutely. And that sounds really interesting, Scott, in a number of ways, really. So one of my questions would be from listening to what you just said. I know you've done quite a lot of work with other sort of co-agencies as well, along with the ambulance service. Is there anything you've brought back from some of these other agencies into the ambulance service, either from a mindset perspective or indeed from a leadership and or managerial perspective, that you see working with some of these co-agencies in the security and or military world, that you've been able to bring back into the pre-hospital care world?
So I've been very fortunate, sort of as a civilian, to kind of be invited in and have guest lectured for staff that are pre-deploying to either hostile environments or sort of conflict zones. And it's something that I always try and kind of bring my NHS and clinical hat forward and don't try and make out or pretend I'm something that I'm not. And I'm not the tallest of chaps, I'm not the biggest of built chaps, and I think it just wouldn't work for me to try and portray or pretend I was something that I was not. So it's interesting because as you know, I've come back from Tunisia, working with a group of humanitarian aid workers that are working and operating in Libya, and it's interesting to adapt the principles of the NHS to staff that have either have got no understanding or experience of what that actually is on the ground, but also kind of bring that into play when you're trying to get them to work and operate in some of these hostile conflict zones and deliver good care in what isn't always seen as good places.
Absolutely, and like I say, translate those concepts to change things down on the ground in quite a dynamic situation, and that's fascinating, actually, Scott. So just looking at some of those dynamics, because one of your hats that you've worn and that you wear when I've been working with you is as an educator. How have you translated some of those lessons learned in sort of fundamentally the best, or indeed the most efficient way to these staff? Because I know with me you've done a lot of simulation workshops, plenary group discussion. Do you feel you get there's more leverage as an educator? There's more leverage in a certain modality of teaching?
I guess as ambulance staff, we're always kind of in our element as characteristics that work in this field, to enjoy the challenge of being dynamic and having to think on your feet. And I think most ambulance staff can probably relate to that and kind of think back to a moment of their own practice or moments in their job where they've got a real buzz or satisfaction. And it's normally where things are unpredictable or unplanned or unexpected, and they are challenged and tested and pushed to respond in that way. And I think for me, who I'm enjoying my practice as much as I did sort of from the day I joined, try and bring that element into my teaching. And some of the best scenarios that you can plan for are the ones that respond and adapt to the environment and the students. And I know when we've talked together, I always start with kind of trying to find out these are the objectives of the course, but actually, we're all humans, and what is it that's brought us here to this sort of learning today, and what is it that they'd like to get from the course, and then reflect back on that at the end of the course and try as a sort of a facilitator to address their individual kind of needs or kind of demons that they have that wouldn't always necessarily be covered in course content, which makes for a really sort of interesting dynamic course, because you've got your course program set, and the challenge then for me as the educator and the facilitator working with the group is to really draw on our breadth of experience, and not stand up and try and confess to be the font of all knowledge, and I think educators that try and do that will eventually kind of become unstuck or unfounded, and students can see through that. But actually, drawing upon the experiences from people in the room, and certainly when it comes to the simulation, we've chatted about how we're going to run a scenario and we get the bare bones. But being able to adapt and then capture it afterwards about what we've learned is, just as exciting now for me as kind of turning up to the big jobs that we've both done, and going, that really didn't go in the direction that I was expecting it to, and being dynamic and responding to the actions means that you get a far more detailed quality simulation. And whether that's, working with a fem doctor, working with air crew, advanced paramedics, doctors, med students, paramedic students, technicians, you'll always come up with something that you weren't expecting. And the people that, you thought you kind of understood through the course come back with a curveball of some new way of moment of thinking that you go, actually, that's something. And that's how new ideas develop and generate. And the course is never really the same from one course to the next.
Yeah. So Scott, sorry to cut across you. Just to say, some of the simulation I've run with you, Scott, some of the fidelity of simulation I've run with you, it's not only changed the game for me. I think what it's done is it's really brought home that the devil is in the detail, and actually bringing students to the most real version of an event, be it a ballistic event, a terrorist event, or just a trauma, a single traumatic injury to one limb, but bringing that home. And what I've learned through you and through making it as real as possible. I know we brought we brought your child Toby into one of the pediatric courses, didn't we? And the final scenario was actually, as a sick child, we had Toby right there, and sort of thrust him into one of the participants' arms, and you've got your delightful son who's happy in anybody's arms, but just to bring that realness and that fidelity to life, I genuinely can't say I've done that as well with other people as I have with you. And I've definitely learned through that actually, if you run simulation in that vein and be prepared to slow it down and pick out, like you said, the learning points, you can actually really unpick not only people's fears and directly address them, but also learn yourself about just navigating the way to debrief it, how to pick out the best bits, and also how to give them the most real version of an experience.
I think that, like you said, the devil is in the detail, and I think it takes a lot of bandwidth and experience to be able to really kind of finesse it. And it's something that I'm, still practicing, and it's only kind of in the last couple of years my comfort zone of kind of where I know I can take things and how I can respond, and the tools that I've got are really kind of becoming finessed in that. And I think for me, it's the lead up and the preparation, the background to the scene is now almost, for me, more important. I'm thinking about making sure the story and the lead in is actually reflective of what the actual injury and clinical work that I want to be done and see. And I think you do end up needing to be almost like producer, director, and I think anything you can kind of commit to the storyline going in. And I was just saying about even more on a week's course in Tunisia, we ran actually that storyline ran for a whole week, where they are a set group of NGOs, they've got a mission, and each day the theory actually gives them the skills to build up on that mission that we're testing them on, and then we'll go and break into scenario world of actually testing them on the theory that they've just learned. Yeah. But then the next scenario builds on that again, and I think dripping them into that sort of storyline, it kind of helps to sort of suspend their disbelief of simulation. Even if you don't have the film set budgets of dealing with real high fidelity actors and injuries, but luckily that was something that we could draw upon. And again, that just goes to emphasize the detail even more. But I think you need to have the structure of what it is, what your learning objectives are, and still be true and honest to the, educational principles of what is it that we're trying to achieve, what are we trying to learn, but then actually allowing for that free learning to take place within the scenario, and that comes from investing in the storyline of it. And I know you and I have chatted about it's an interesting world, and people come because they want to play, and sometimes that's a bad thing, and sometimes that's a good thing. I think we need to acknowledge that people best learn when they're enjoying themselves and having fun. And that's why, we always have smiles on our faces when we teach together. And hopefully that comes across, and the students kind of have that same enjoyment as we get from teaching. But I'm keen that the courses that we run or I kind of work to are not courses just to satisfy people's desire to play. And I know there are providers out there that do that and will get absolutely rave reviews. But they're not always the same educational sort of foundation and grounding and sound principles that actually I want to kind of work towards.
Yeah, I totally agree, Scott. I think you've got to meld the two, really, that sense of play and that sense of enjoyment, but with actually some robust and some steadfast ILOs, so intended learning outcomes, so that they do come away with something, and change pace, change modality, so that people feel like they're changing gears, interacting with different parts of their brain. You can be in a discussion 1 minute and or a debate. You can be in a simulation the next. You can be in a workshop the next, and then you could potentially be in a lecture the next. But it's changing pace, so that people aren't necessarily sitting back and just letting it all wash over them. That they're interacting with that information, that knowledge. So just to change tack slightly, Scott, and just do a little bit of a deep dive on your EPRR experience, so your emergency planning, resilience, and response experience, and your emergency planning background, because I know you've got a diploma in emergency planning. What has that? Is there anything that's informed and or taught you about the current situation, either from a demand profiling perspective, or indeed from a contingency and planning perspective? Is there anything that you can extrapolate out from that?
I think the first thing that comes to mind really is kind of like the reporting lines and structures that we have, certainly in the UK, and then wider experience of kind of working and understanding things like the World Health Organization, and whether that's through high consequence illnesses, and certainly things that we prepared for in the past. But pandemic flu has been on the national risk register, for a long, long time. I think if you cast your mind back to the days of when we saw H1N1 and sort of avian bird flu, I think we started to, and it was declared a pandemic then. We didn't see the severity of illness as we're now seeing with COVID-19. And there were some lessons that we learned from that, and certainly the pandemic card of how we triage and cast calls and interrogate calls. And that's something that we've also put into practice when we were looking at our management of snow that hit us quite hard with the beast from the east. And these are all things that rely on the same sort of reporting structures that we're using at the moment for COVID. So I'm not directly part of the EPRR team now. But saying that, within the last week, I've been down into our trust incident support cell. It's supporting the trust's response, and the reporting lines and the reports that we're using now have been the same that we would use for other critical and severe emergencies. And I think that gives a degree of confidence. We're talking to people that I talked to when we were looking at hospital closures or tracing of contacts or equipment from Salisbury, Novichok, or when we had people stranded because of snow. It's funny that you're talking around the same times of year. I've made jokes that, I'm in the control room with an Easter egg in front of my desk, and that's not the first time that we've dealt with incidents of a serious nature around the Easter period. So I think having the confidence that, of our ability to data collect what's happening. And so for us at the moment, to bring it relevant to COVID-19, everybody that we're using sort of PPE, making sure that we're collating that information. So we've got a good understanding of what our usage is, where our pressures are, what particular PPE is being used over others. So that really needs, boots on the ground, reporting and feeding into that, and then a collating system. And that's what we're doing.
Yeah. And
that's being fed back to the regional public health areas, and our sort of request for PPE is based on that, and we can then forecast and model and plan with kind of what our anticipated demand will look like, and then make that into some realistic figures of, okay, what are our realistic expectations of PPE usage on different demand profiles. And we're going a lot further than we ever did for avian bird flu. Our response is completely different in regards of what we're required to do clinically. So it's an interesting time, and I think the response that we're doing is all but mirrored across all of the ambulance service trusts. Our demand and pressure may be different, depending on the regional service that you're working for, but kind of the goings on behind the scene is actually kind of all feeding into a national picture. We've got the National Ambulance Control Centre set up in the West Mids that all the trusts will be feeding into, and obviously they will then be feeding that into central government.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, that reporting system is good for modelling for both future pandemics and lessons learned from what we're experiencing now. So just from a demand profile perspective, have you seen, I know we were talking about before, have you that you've seen a concurrent shift in activity and in occupancy, bed space in hospital, but also the demand in pre-hospital care? Have you seen that shift sort of de-escalate, or indeed is there much in the way of demand at the moment, either in hospital or out of hospital for you?
I think for where we were, think back several weeks ago with certainly what the scientific advice was sort of saying for warning, and some of the modelling that we were looking at. I think it was only right that the whole central government and health system, NHS England, PHE, prepared us, the community trusts and the acute trusts, for what was looking to be like an unprecedented demand, an overwhelming demand on the service. And I'm not sure if we captured before, but we were just saying about war being a great instigator for change and learning and development. And sadly, it's all but been similarly to a war on the pandemic of COVID-19. And sadly, with that has been opportunities to either change of appetite of risk or through necessity. And we, in the early stages, didn't really see too much change. Then we started seeing the predicted worried well, where our confirmed cases were relatively low, disproportionate to the numbers of calls that we were certainly receiving in the southwest, I think. That was difficult and a challenge because there was lots of different policies, and there was lots of, I think, social media jokes within the ambulance service world in particular about the number of changes of policies and procedures daily, almost, as we were trying to quickly adapt to how we needed to look after our staff and how we need to look after each other and respond to our patients. That gave us a good opportunity, certainly in the southwest where I'm at the moment, to almost practice and drill our infection prevention control procedures about our level 2s, level 3s, and understand a little bit better than we maybe did before about aerosol generated procedures and levels of protection that we were required for and when. But in answer to your question on kind of demand, we saw as the pandemic's gone on and the media have really sort of focused certainly on London, where the numbers I know went through the roof, certainly for LAS and their call volumes, from their norms of sort of 4,000 a day up into sort of like 11,000, I think, at one point. I'm right to understand. Our numbers and demand profile has sort of reduced slightly, but what we have seen is a change in our acuity going up. And I think that's something that's reflected similarly in the acute trusts across the region, broadly speaking, speaking to colleagues in different areas and working with different acute trusts, and even kind of our GP partners and out of hours. They've seen a lessening in pressure for them. We've got good bed occupancy at the moment, which, if we are to see peaks and high acuity patients, as we were predicting, we're in a good position to respond to them at the moment. But that does beg the question of where have all the patients gone that were calling us this time last year, that were calling a few weeks ago. And I think it just goes to prove, actually, we are victims of our own success, certainly in the ambulance service and it's somewhat in A&E, where we will respond most of the time and see people and are very good at answering their calls for help and putting things in place to look after them, which is good for patient outcomes, but it's not always the most appropriate resource to sort of meet that need. Whereas at the moment, A&Es and certainly ITUs are in a good position to respond and deal with any influx should that come. And we can talk about should that wave come in some of the outer London regions. But I think the main thing we've noticed is certainly a drop in activity, operational responses. Our normal metrics of call performance are doing actually quite well because our resourcing call profile is matched for once at the moment, as opposed to being overwhelmed. And a word that would normally be described with the ambulance service is relentless, whereas we're seeing a difference at the moment. Some of that isn't just because of numbers calling in. Some of that is because we've had to change, and we're putting a lot of emphasis and resource in our clinical hubs, looking at preventing calls coming out, getting a response. And some of that's obviously with the introduction of the pandemic card for the computer-aided dispatch that's recently sort of been instigated nationally, I believe. And some of that is just some of the work that each individual local ambulance service is doing to look at their hear and treat, which has always been an increasing area of interest for the ambulance services as they sort of try and grapple with their demand on the service of limited numbers of resources that we do have.
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. Absolutely. So just looking at those numbers and that shift in demographics and that maybe like de-escalated demand at the moment, do you think there's maybe a small sliver of people that should be calling us or that should be in A&E that aren't necessarily doing so? Because I know the policy at the moment in London is that relatives can't come to hospital. So I know I've seen a cadre of patients maybe a little bit too late in the patient journey actually that should have gone and then ended up as cardiac arrests, but they didn't go because they couldn't have someone with them, and that probably was the time to catch them prior to them falling off the cliff into a sort of a decompensated state. Do you think that those cardiac patients exist where you are at the moment, and do you think that they're kind of being kind of not being captured in what you'd normally see?
No, I think definitely. I think regardless of kind of like your viral numbers, I think because it's a national lockdown, then it's national guidance, it's national procedures. I think the same unintended consequences will apply no matter where you are. Our acute is in the same way, following sort of PHE at reducing footfall and aren't allowing immediate kind of care. Obviously, there are some exceptions to that, and I think that's worth important. Certainly because they feature around sort of labour, maternity and children. where and people with complex health needs that needs and rely upon carer, and I think that's important to kind of emphasize and get out there. And I'm seeing rumblings that is beginning to be looked at on a case-by-case situation, as opposed to a blanket no. And I know that people that are palliative or are sadly likely to die are being allowed, in certain cases, relatives. And I think it is right that we just take an individual approach for that patient and the clinical environment where they are, to kind of make that assessment on risk. And exposure on transmission as well. But with regards kind of those unintentional, unintended consequences of certainly the lockdown, I know I saw a lady a couple of weeks ago. She was treated with PPE because of respiratory symptoms as a suspected COVID case, although there were some other differentials, and the other differentials were probably more likely for us in our management pre-hospital. And I think that the lockdown and isolation probably meant that she didn't call for help. She self-diagnosed and self-attributed her shortness of breath and cough to pneumonias that she'd previously had. And in actual fact, it turns out that she had a PE, and it was too far gone by the time we arrived. That although that she was transported, it was something that sadly resulted in her losing her life. And I think there are similar cases, maybe not with necessarily PEs, but other illnesses and injuries where people are managing at home when they necessarily should be kind of seeking that help. But I think the numbers that I'm kind of seeing and hearing from, they are few. We're certainly seeing a greater benefit from people self-managing and seeking alternative support, and not attending A&E. Hence why we've got really good capacity in our A&E departments at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to pivot slightly, Scott, and look at a different aspect of the system, just groundswell amongst staff. Is there a general? Do you sense there's a general fear amongst staff in regards to COVID-19, or do you feel like staff feel sort of prepared and or willing to go and treat the community and the AGP producing procedures? Do you sense a tangible fear or not so?
I think there wouldn't be anybody that sort of is doing our job at the moment that at some point in the recent history has not necessarily been feared, but has certainly had concern for what's going on. I think we're all human, and all of us at some point will have probably taken a moment to reflect and think about actually kind of the risks and what we are doing. And I think that's something that's probably, as our awareness, understanding and familiarity with our response under sort of the COVID-19 pandemic has developed, something that we've probably better discussed and aired and looked at amongst ourselves and shared in discussion, which is only benefit to help with those fears and apprehensions. I don't consider myself really doing too much out of the norm in regards job-wise. The 909 calls will come. I will receive them in the same way, and I'm responding and seeing patients and making judgment calls and assessments of where they're best looked after, and if needs be putting things in place. Things are a little bit more difficult to kind of put packages of care in at home, but things are, as people are getting used to the procedures, in the community, and they're coming up with ways to overcome things and difficulties and challenges, we are seeing that sort of free up a little bit more, and almost like the new norm developing. And there's been lots of discussions on PPE, and I don't really kind of want to get drawn into the political sort of twos and fro's on that. I think my personal view, if I'm going to come out, really will be I have concerns over the aprons that are recommended for level 2, which we're using across the board for all our patients now. As we know, the numbers of cases in the community are higher than we probably fully appreciate, certainly because of the lack of testing at the moment. But I think for me, just the apron is probably, you know, a standard apron is maybe sufficient in acute care settings, but you know, my colleagues and I almost feel like flagpoles. You know, we're working outside, the jobs are still going on outside. We're not just dealing with medical illness inside homes. Even just earlier, you know, dealing with a fall off a ladder, a DIY incident outside.
Yeah.
The aprons aren't necessarily the best thing for us. And there's probably a whole host of reasons why that hasn't really been fully appreciated and discussed and looked at. I certainly know a few trusts in the country are looking at the gowns and have introduced gowns. That's just not something we're looking at doing at the moment. With regards to the face protection, I think we were in the early stages going to level 3 protection early when it wasn't necessary, and I think it was important that where people had an understanding of that, you know, myself, we try and educate and inform staff about the levels of protection and when they are used, because otherwise I think we would have depleted our own stocks of FFP3 level 3 face protection if we were going to use them as a bog standard approach to all cases. And I think it's right that we take this dynamic decision making. AGP, there's obviously some discrepancies and differences between the guidance from sort of PHE, Public Health England, and the World Health Organization. Certainly around the areas of contention that kind of come up in discussion are nebulisation and CPR. But on the whole, certainly I've seen a lot of the fear dissipate, I think, over the last week. I think just as people get more confident and comfortable with working and making the call, I think opting for level 2 for all patients does simplify things in some way, and gives you one less thing to think about and makes it very clear when you need to then escalate to level 3. But on the whole, you know, we're still humans. I don't feel like I have some superhero ability to fight off COVID. I certainly don't feel like a hero in what I'm doing. Like I said, it's a normal day in that sense. And that's something I think I would echo with my colleagues. I think the heroes are probably the families who we leave behind when we go to work, who maybe are not medical and maybe don't have the appreciation of the decision making that we do and the steps that we take to protect ourselves and our families and the public. And I think that's probably a difficult thing for the families who have to kind of wave goodbye to staff and are only left with the cycle of the news to kind of really inform their decisions and fears. And I think for me, that's a bigger issue for staff. Having that worry at home is probably playing a bigger sort of mind trouble than necessarily responding to the patients.
Yeah. So to your point, Scott, I find it really interesting what you were saying about pre-hospital cases. You know, normal pre-hospital care goes on every day. You know, people are still having a heart attack, still falling off ladders, still having business as usual, really, what we normally respond to. But also to your other point as well around families and around leaving families at home, you know, the psychological resilience that families, I mean, I know you've got a young family, you've got 2 lovely young twins, you've got little Toby as well. You know, having to leave your wife at home and her having to sort of, I guess, you know, be there day in, day out, and become, it is quite socially isolating. What I've certainly seen in London is a real prevalence of and rise in mental health issues, actually, both from a social isolation point of view for people without families, but also people with families as well, which haven't really got the social support around them. Have you seen a rise in mental health or felt the pinch of mental health in service down here?
I think with regards to our sort of patient numbers that we're seeing, I think we've seen sort of a drop in numbers over the last couple of weeks, and whether that's because they are being managed in a different way from the hubs, their actual call for help that's coming through the 999 system is less at the moment. Saying that, today, I have seen my sort of first flurry of cases where it's been due to social isolation that's kind of been their primary issue. I think today is an interesting day as we await the update with regards the deadline of the lockdown and whether that will or won't continue. It's looking and feeling like it's most likely to continue. I think that's a milestone. I think a psychological milestone that people will have waited and got to in their heads as a resilient sort of deadline point. And I think when we pass that, and if we're to continue for a further period of time, I think that will then see a change, and we will begin to see probably more calls for the effects of social isolation, whether that's physical health that's taken an effect, or that sort of psychological sort of mental health well-being. And with that is like the staff that we work with as well, who are already kind of maybe having things that they're just sort of ticking along and coping with, and this is maybe sort of one of those final sort of pressures in their box that I'm sure all paramedics and ambulance staff can relate to, that have the box of their own mental health.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things I've talked about elsewhere is sometimes a real absence of self-care amongst staff. I'm guilty of it as well, if I'm being honest, Scott. It's just an absence of sleeping well, eating well, exercising regularly, getting out to see friends, because I almost think it's equally as important what you do on time off away from work as what you do when you're at work, because if you don't rest adequately when you're away from work, when you come back to work, you're never actually able to give 100%, nor are you able to necessarily function to your at capacity. And have you seen sort of an absence of self-care either in the general population of patients or indeed with staff at work?
So I think I'm really fortunate that the staff that I'm working with at the moment are absolutely, some of the best that I've ever worked with in my career, because they've seemed to have really grasped this concept of looking out for each other and looking after each other, and that's something that sadly had kind of, because of the pressures, certainly in inner cities where the pace and workload was increasing, and the time on station to do the informal handovers, the informal debriefing and the laughing and joking, those times were just gone. Now, I'm not saying that there were any more opportunities, certainly in the sort of North Devon area, but I'm certainly seeing, remnants of past times where staff genuinely took an interest and care for each other and socialise, and I think that is a good resilient factor for the staff that certainly I'm here working with at the moment. Patients wise, and I think, like I said, that 3-week isolation lockdown deadline, I think people will see that probably as a mental sort of hurdle, and it will be interesting to see how people in the community sort of will deal with that. Sadly, the people that we come across vary so greatly in their sort of understanding and ability to comprehend with what's going on. The 84-year-old I saw today had very little insight as to the dangers of just a simple walk down to the shops and the encounters that she was going to sort of come across. But then equally, she's isolated with no family, staying at her own house. Her phone's not working, and actually, what is that risk for the greater good? And I recall from sort of my early days of sort of like a response manager, when dealing with common day fire alarm in a nursing home, and even just making decisions on evacuating a nursing home. Officers will tell you, it's something you avoid at all costs, because we know the vulnerable population. You add dementia in that as well. Just the fact of the move, an emergency move, unscheduled move, and evacuation of the place, could be enough to actually be the greater risk,
Mm.
not necessarily the reason why you're evacuating in the first place. And if we turn that on our heads, almost like an evacuation, that isolation is equally just as risky, and we'll have those unintended consequences that we mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we just come into land on the conversation, a couple of questions really, just from your perspective. One question I'd like to sort of pose to you really is, if you had a message for the community of plus 200,000 doctors, paramedics, and nurses that follow World Extreme Medicine and that listen to this, is there any kind of message of positivity and or encouragement you'd like to give to people out there?
I think the first of all is that the NHS is receiving a lot of recognition and a lot of praise for what we are all doing, and we are all just small cogs in the biggest machine, the biggest employer in the world, that is unrivaled internationally. Despite the gripes and grumbles of the politics of Brexit, of our scientists and our pharmaceuticals, and what the future lies ahead, is we still have and are able to draw upon some of the best minds in the world. We're taking a very pragmatic approach. We're looking at data. We're constantly reviewing. The staff in ITU, some of the reports and the teleconferences I've been party to, they really are pulling together and sharing best practice, and it's almost like the Herculean war efforts of digging deep. We are all in it together, and that camaraderie across the whole sort of NHS as a whole. Whereas once there may be sort of silos or sort of rivalries, those have all been set aside, and it's one common goal at the moment, and that's just to get through this, and we will get through that. So my message to the public is listen to your health providers, listen to those government briefings, and be guided by those. I think sadly, our death numbers will probably stay high as around the current numbers, and marginally see an increase in those. Certainly the work that's going on in the community with care homes will probably be the new front line as we progress forward, and I think there's some difficult conversations that we will probably be hearing about how we will manage those and what's the best things for groups and individuals of patients in those care settings. But the work that everyone's doing by staying at home is having an effect. It's certainly, the Southwest has got, luckily some of the lowest numbers. Some of that's geography, some of that is maintaining that social distancing and adherence to the self-isolation. So listen to those government rules and kind of go with them. For my colleagues, I've never been prouder to work amongst you all, and thank you for everything that we're doing together, really. And that would probably be my message.
Oh, Scott, that's fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic. Absolutely. And just to come into land on one point you made earlier, Scott, around sort of education, really, and just around how to get the best out of people, because I'm mindful, and I'm speaking to people all the time that have finished their degrees early, their medical degrees early. They've come out of university early as paramedics. They've finished in their third year and been pulled out. There's a lot of firemen here and military personnel which are retraining at the moment. What would you say to people that have finished med school early, finished paramedic science early, and or other domains of practice, to come across, just to sort of to reassure them at this time?
Sadly, I don't think there's been a better opportunity to ever ask for help than there is at the moment. I think the willingness to help anybody within the health service at the moment is the highest I've seen in certainly coming up for sort of my sort of 17, 18 years of practice. And that's always probably been the case. And I think we are probably, through our own barriers, maybe reluctant when we're new to sort of ask or be fearful of kind of stepping out and wanting to ask what may seem like silly, obvious questions, but I would always say ask. People will always kind of stop and take time to kind of try and help, because we've all been there. We've all been that new member of staff, and at the moment it's an unprecedented time to be a newly qualified member of staff. So ask. People will stop, will help, and direct. There's phrases at the moment of there's no such thing as an emergency in a pandemic, and that's really about, you know, taking your time out to look after yourself and put your safety procedures in. With that, I think we need to just recalibrate that clock, and as we sort of look towards the future of what that new world is going to look like post sort of COVID-19, and I hope the post world we do learn a lot of lessons, maybe not just on the things that we could have done well, and, like, you know, we're not just necessarily talking about the procurement side or the politics side. I'm talking about kind of more global generic issues about lifestyle, how we work, how we operate, new opportunities going forward. It's an interesting and exciting time for a newly qualified member of staff, but certainly I would say to my NQP colleagues is, you know, ask. People will take the time to explain. You're not alone. You're not doing this on your own.
Yeah, Scott, that's fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic. And I think a lovely message, actually, just to finish off on, because I think you're right. Even as a critical care paramedic, there's sometimes and some circumstances that, you know, I just need to cross check. I need to ask. I've been in 20 years. I think you've been in the same. And we still need to ask for help sometimes. And so I think it's never beyond you just to ask if you're feeling overwhelmed, or indeed want assistance at all. So I think that's a fantastic message, mate. So with that, I will finish off. Listen, just thanks for your time today, Scott. I really appreciate it, and thanks for, you know, all your help over the years as teaching alongside you, mate. It's been absolutely fantastic. So thanks for today.
No, all the best, and we'll speak soon, no doubt.